The sun over Tulsa was hot enough to melt the tar right through Marcus's boots. But it was the sound that turned his blood to ice. A sharp, metallic snap, like a dry bone breaking in the wind. 50 feet above the concrete, a bright yellow safety line didn't just break. It disintegrated into a cloud of useless nylon fibers. Marcus lunged for the edge, his fingers grazing nothing but shimmering heat waves as a young man's silent, wide-eyed face vanished into the abyss. The dull thud that followed vibrated through the steel skeleton of the building, a sound so heavy it seemed to silence the entire city. Minutes later, Marcus stood over a pool of spreading crimson, his hands slick with a fluid that shouldn't have been on his cuffs. As a wall of grieving, sun-scorched workers surged toward him with clenched fists and accusations of murder. Marcus looked down at the frayed end of the new safety rope. It felt like cheap plastic, brittle and hollow. Nothing like the life-saving gear he had personally signed off on. He looked toward the air-conditioned luxury of the site trailer, realizing the man who had called him son for 20 years was already gone, leaving Marcus standing alone on a foundation built of lies and blood-stained grit. The sun over Tulsa didn't just shine, it prosecuted. It was a relentless, interrogating heat that turned the sky into a bleached sheet of zinc, made the horizon shimmer like a fever dream. Up on the roof of the new shopping complex, the air was a thick soup of boiling bitumen and oxidized metal, a scent that clung to the back of the throat until every breath tasted of industrial decay. Marcus Caldwell wiped a sleeve across his forehead, but the fabric was already saturated, leaving a smear of salt and grit across his brow. He watched the crew move through the haze, their silhouettes distorted by the rising heat waves, looking less like men and more like ghosts wading through syrup. Beneath his heavy work boots, the tar felt soft, almost sentient, trying to pull him down into the skeletal frame of the building. He leaned against a hot parapet, his knuckles white against the brick. Every strike of a hammer in the distance felt like a nail being driven into his own temples. The city sprawled out below them, a grid of sun-baked asphalt and glittering glass. But from this height, it looked fragile, a toy set waiting to be crushed. Marcus adjusted his grip on the clipboard, the plastic backing slippery with sweat. He was 44, a man who had spent his life climbing ladders both literal and corporate, and today felt like the summit, or perhaps the edge. A shadow fell over him, followed by the familiar, heavy scent of expensive cologne and Cuban tobacco. Elijah Vance didn't belong on a roof in 100-degree heat. Yet there he was, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his linen suit defying the humidity. He clapped a hand on Marcus's shoulder, a grip that felt like a branding iron, heavy and possessive. "Look at them, Marcus," Elijah boomed, his voice carrying over the whine of the circular saws. "The pulse of the city. And you're the one keeping the heart beating. Keeping it beating." The workers began to drift toward them, drawn by the gravity of the man who signed the checks. Elijah's smile was a masterpiece of porcelain and practiced charisma. He didn't just walk, he occupied space. He gestured toward the digital tablets the foreman held, pointing at the green bars and the soaring productivity charts. "We're ahead of schedule. 3 weeks. 3, Elijah announced, his voice rising to a crescendo that silenced the hum of the generators. He turned Marcus toward the crowd, his arm hooking around Marcus's neck like a gilded yoke. "I'm an old dog, boys, and every old dog needs a porch to sit on. When this ribbon is cut, Marcus here won't be on the roof anymore. He'll be in the corner office. My office. My office." A low, guttural cheer rose from the men, a mix of genuine respect and the desperate hope that a new boss might mean a new era. Marcus felt the weight of their stares, eyes narrowed against the sun, faces masked by dust and exhaustion. He tried to summon a smile, but his jaw felt locked. Elijah's grip tightened on his elbow, a silent reminder of the debt Marcus owed, a physical manifestation of the tether that had pulled him out of the dirt and into the light. "You've earned this, mijo," Elijah whispered, the warmth of his breath smelling of espresso. "Don't let the height make you dizzy." Dizzy. Marcus looked away, his gaze drifting to the far corner of the roof where the younger guys were finishing the flashing. Among them was Diego, a kid with quick hands and a laugh that hadn't yet been muffled by the trade. Diego was balancing on the very lip of the north carniz, his body angled precariously as he reached for a stubborn corner bracket. He was a speck of vibrant life against the gray concrete. Something caught Marcus's eye, a flicker of movement that felt wrong. He watched the safety line attached to Diego's harness. It was a bright, synthetic yellow, but as it dragged across the jagged edge of a steel I-beam, it didn't slide. It frayed. The sound was what haunted Marcus later, a sharp, metallic crack, like a dry branch snapping or a small caliber pistol firing in an alley. Time didn't just slow down. It curdled. Marcus saw the individual fibers of the nylon rope pop, white heartstrings of the cord exploding into a fuzzy halo. "Diego!" Marcus's voice was a raw tear in the afternoon quiet. The boy looked back, his eyes widening, not with fear yet, but with confusion. Then the last strand gave way. It didn't break so much as it vanished. Diego's hands clawed at the air, his fingers skidding off the sun-slicked metal of the beam. He didn't scream. He just exhaled a soft, surprised "oh" as gravity claimed its due. Marcus lunged, his boots skidding on the melting tar, his hand outstretched as if he could catch the wind. He reached the edge just as the yellow tail of the broken rope whipped past, a useless snake disappearing into the abyss. The impact was a sound Marcus felt in his marrow. A dull, wet thud that seemed to vibrate through the entire steel structure of the building. He looked down, his breath hitching in a throat suddenly filled with the taste of copper. Diego lay on the concrete staging area 50 feet below. He looked like a discarded rag doll, his limbs bent at angles that defied anatomy. A halo of dark, viscous red began to bloom from beneath his cracked helmet, spreading across the gray dust of the site like an inkblot test. "Call it in! Call it in!" Marcus screamed, though his voice felt thin and distant. He didn't wait for the elevator. He hit the stairs, his boots thundering against the metal risers, the sound echoing like a heart attack. When he burst out onto the ground level, the heat hit him again. But now it felt cold, a clammy, tomb-like chill. He fell to his knees beside the boy, the grit of the construction site grinding into his skin. Diego's chest was hitching, a shallow, rattling sound that made Marcus's own lungs ache. He pressed his hands against the boy's side, trying to hold the life inside, feeling the hot, sticky reality of the failure seep through his fingers and stain his cuffs. "Stay with me, Diego. Stay with me. Stay," Marcus hissed through gritted teeth. He pulled his phone out with a hand that shook so violently he nearly dropped it into the pool of blood. He barked the coordinates to the dispatcher, his eyes locked on Diego's face. The boy's eyes were rolled back, flickering, searching for a light Marcus couldn't provide. Then came the noise of the world rushing back in. The screech of tires, the heavy boots of the crew descending, and then the voices. It started as a low murmur, a vibration in the air that quickly sharpened into a jagged blade of sound. The gates of the site were swarmed. Word traveled fast in the neighborhood surrounding the project. Marcus looked up and saw a wall of faces, men he recognized from the site, and others, women in dark shawls, brothers with eyes like flint. A woman screamed, a high, piercing wail that cut through the distant siren of the ambulance. She threw herself toward the police line, her fingernails catching Marcus's forearm as he tried to stand. She wasn't just crying. She was mourning a living man. "What did you give him?" a voice roared. It was a large man, an armaturist named Rodriguez, his chest heaving. He shoved Marcus, a hard, two-handed strike that sent Marcus stumbling back against the corrugated metal of a tool shed. "That rope was trash. You killed him for a deadline." "It was an accident," Marcus stammered, his hands raised, palms out, still slick with Diego's blood. "We check the gear. We check it." "Liar!" another voice spat. The crowd surged, a sea of sweat-stained shirts and clenched fists. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and impending violence. Marcus felt the cold ribs of the shed pressing into his spine. He looked for Elijah, but the boss was gone, vanished back into the air-conditioned sanctuary of his SUV. Marcus looked at the crowd, at the brother of the boy on the ground, whose eyes were twin pits of grief. He felt a sudden, sharp clarity. The rope hadn't just snapped, it had disintegrated. "I will find out," Marcus said, his voice cracking but gaining volume. He stood taller, ignoring the sting of the scratches on his arms. "I will check the manifests. Every carabiner, every inch of nylon. I will find out why that rope failed. Why it failed." The anger in the crowd didn't vanish, but it shifted, turning into a heavy, suffocating silence. They watched him with a distrust that felt like a physical weight. As the paramedics finally loaded the stretcher, Marcus watched the ambulance pull away, its lights painting the dusty construction site in rhythmic pulses of emergency red. He didn't go home. He didn't call his wife. He drove straight to the main office, the sun finally dipping below the horizon, leaving the sky the color of a fresh bruise. The headquarters of Caldwell & Son was a hushed tomb of glass and polished stone. Marcus's boots squeaked on the marble, a discordant sound in the Cathedral of Commerce. He bypassed his own desk and went straight to the archives, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He felt like a thief in his own house. He found the cabinet for the current quarter. The seal was fresh, the adhesive still tacky. He ripped it off, the sound of tearing plastic loud as a gunshot in the empty hallway. He began to pull folders, dumping them onto the mahogany table. Paper dust rose in a cloud, tickling his throat. He flipped through invoices, his eyes scanning for the familiar Titan logo. The gold standard of safety gear they had used for 20 years. His fingers stopped on a sheet from a month ago. The name at the top was Global Safe. Marcus frowned, the fluorescent lights overhead humming with a low-frequency buzz that made his skin crawl. He pulled up the price list. The cost for a 1,000-foot spool of Global Safe nylon was barely 20% of what they usually paid. He looked at the specifications. It was utility cord, rated for hauling buckets of nails, not for human weight, not for lives. His mouth went dry, the taste of old coffee and dust turning to ash. He opened the digital ledger, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He followed the money trail, his eyes squinting at the blue light of the monitor. The payments to Global Safe were routed through a shell company, an LLC registered to a P.O. box in the Caymans. But the kickback trail was amateurish, hidden behind a thin veil of consulting fees. Marcus felt a cold sweat break across his neck as he saw the recipient's account number. It was Elijah's personal offshore account. Every dollar saved on those rotting ropes had gone into Elijah's pocket. The silver hair, the linen suits, the Zagorodny Club. It was all paid for in frayed nylon and broken bones. Marcus leaned back, the leather chair creaking. He felt a wave of nausea. He looked at the photo on his desk, Him and Elijah at the groundbreaking, smiling like brothers. He felt a sudden urge to vomit. But then, his gaze drifted to the bottom of the Physical Procurement Act. He froze. There, in the approved buy box, was a signature. Bold, black ink, manicured and precise. It was his own name. Marcus stared at it, his breath coming in short, jagged gasps. He remembered that night, 3 weeks ago. Elijah had come into his office with a stack of papers, laughing about a new golf handicap, asking Marcus to clear the deck so they could head to dinner. Marcus hadn't even looked. He had trusted the hand that fed him. He was the one who had signed the death warrant. Legally, the blood on his hands wasn't just a metaphor. It was a matter of record. He sat in the dark office for a long time, the only sound the ticking of the clock on the wall. He was a Soyuchastnik, a ghost in the machine of Elijah's greed. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had tried to hold Diego's life inside his body, and saw that they were still stained with the boy's blood, dried now into a dark, accusing crust. The next morning, Marcus didn't go to the site. He drove to the country club. The air there was different, filtered, scented with jasmine, and the sterile smell of money. He found Elijah on the veranda, a linen napkin tucked into his collar, a plate of oysters on ice before him. The sun was already high, turning the golf course into a sea of emerald. Marcus didn't wait for a greeting. He slammed the Global Safe folder onto the table, sending a spray of ice water across Elijah's silk tie. "You used me," Marcus hissed, his voice low and vibrating with a rage he could barely contain. "Those ropes, they weren't even rated for climbing. You bought trash and kept the change, kept it." Elijah didn't flinch. He slowly picked up an oyster, slid it into his mouth, and chewed with a terrifying deliberation. He took a sip of chilled Chablis before looking up. His eyes weren't the eyes of a mentor anymore. They were the eyes of a shark. "Sit down, Marcus," Elijah said, his voice as smooth as the wine. "You're making a scene. A scene. I don't care about the scene. Diego is in a coma. His spine is shattered because you wanted a bigger boat." Elijah leaned forward, his face hardening. "I didn't want a bigger boat, you ungrateful prick. I wanted to keep this company afloat during a recession. I wanted to make sure you had a salary to pay for that fancy house your wife is so fond of." He gestured to the folder. "And let's be clear about the paperwork. Your name is on the approval, not mine. If this goes to the DA, I'm just a grieving owner. You're the negligent manager who cut corners. You." Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. I'll tell them you gave me the papers." "And who will they believe?" Elijah asked, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The man who built half of Tulsa, or the guy who was so desperate for a promotion he didn't check the safety specs? Don't be a martyr, Marcus. It's a messy role, and the pay is terrible." Elijah reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope. He slid it across the table. It was heavy, the edges bulging. "There's $50,000 in there," Elijah said. "Consider it a bonus for the stress of the accident. Go home. Take Sarah on a vacation. By the time you get back, the insurance will have settled, and we'll have a new crew." Marcus stared at the envelope. The smell of the money, ink, and old paper seemed to compete with the smell of the oysters. It was the price of his silence, the price of Diego's life. He drove home in a daze, the envelope sitting on the passenger seat like a live grenade. When he walked through the front door, the house felt too large, too quiet. The air conditioning hummed, a sterile, expensive sound. Sarah was in the kitchen, her blonde hair pulled back in a perfect knot. She was glowing. She held up a set of architectural renderings, her eyes bright with a feverish joy. "Marcus, the builders called. If we put the deposit down today, they'll break ground on the Brookside lot by Monday." She hugged him, her head resting on his chest, right over the pocket where he'd tucked the envelope. "We're finally doing it. No more renting. A real home. A home." Marcus felt a cold lump of lead settle in his stomach. He looked at the renderings, the floor-to-ceiling glass, the marble island, the life they had dreamed of. It was all right there. All he had to do was keep his mouth shut. All he had to do was let Diego be a statistic. "Sarah, Don't tell me it's too much," she interrupted, her voice sharpening with a hint of the old fear, the fear of being not enough. "You've worked so hard for this. Elijah says you're the future of the firm. We deserve this, Marcus. We do." He looked at her, seeing the desperation behind the perfection, and he knew he couldn't tell her. Not yet. He felt like a man standing on a dissolving bridge, watching both shores recede into the mist. He went back to the office late that night, driven by a restless, gnawing guilt. He needed to see the report Elijah had prepared for the insurance company. He bypassed the security desk, his heart thumping against his ribs. The file was on the server, marked confidential. Marcus opened it, and the bile rose in his throat. The report was a work of fiction. It claimed Diego had been warned about the equipment. It claimed he had intentionally bypassed the secondary safety lock to work faster. It even included a forged statement from a witness who didn't exist. Elijah wasn't just covering his tracks. He was burying the boy under a mountain of lies. Marcus tried to edit the file, but his access was denied. A red box popped up on the screen. "Access revoked. Contact system administrator." He felt a chill run down his spine. Elijah was moving faster than he was. He left the office and drove to the warehouse, the sprawling, rusted heart of the company's physical assets. He needed the physical evidence. He needed a piece of that rope before it was lost in a dumpster. The warehouse was a cavern of shadows and the smell of stale grease. Marcus let himself in through the side door, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the gloom. He found the bin where the gear from the site had been tossed. He reached in, his fingers brushing against the rough nylon. He found the frayed end, the white fibers looking like bone in the torchlight. He took out a pocket knife, ready to cut a sample for a private lab. "I wouldn't do that, Marcus." The voice came from the darkness behind a stack of lumber. Two men stepped into the light, Jim and Bob, two of Elijah's most loyal enforcers, men who handled the dirty work that didn't involve spreadsheets. "The boss said you might come sniffing around," Jim said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. He held a heavy iron pry bar in one hand. "He said you were stressed, that you needed to go home and rest. Rest." "This rope is evidence, Jim," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "A kid is in the hospital." "The kid was careless," Bob spat, stepping closer. "And you're being a nuisance. Give us the knife, Marcus. Don't make this a physical problem. A physical problem." They closed in, their shadows stretching long and distorted across the concrete floor. Marcus felt the weight of the knife in his hand, but he knew he couldn't fight them. Not here. Not like this. He backed away, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm. "You're making a mistake," Marcus said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "No," a new voice said. Elijah stepped out from the shadows of the loading dock, his silhouette framed by the headlights of his SUV. He looked tired, but his eyes were as cold as the moon. "The mistake was yours, Marcus. I offered you a way out. I offered you the world. Elijah held up a piece of paper, the termination notice. As of 10 minutes ago, you are no longer an employee of Caldwell & Son. Your corporate accounts are frozen. Your reputation is being adjusted. You tried to steal company property tonight. That's what the police will hear. The police. Elijah reached out and took the magnetic keycard from Marcus's hand, snapping it in two with a sharp clack. Go home, Marcus. If you're lucky, you'll still have a wife by morning. But you don't have a career. Not in this city. Not ever. Marcus walked out of the warehouse, the night air feeling like a shroud. He got into his truck and saw his phone screen lit up with a dozen alerts. His bank account, the one with the house deposit, showed a balance of 0. Account flagged for internal audit. He sat in the dark, the steering wheel cold beneath his hands. He had nothing. No job, no money, no future. He looked at his reflection in the rearview mirror and saw a man he didn't recognize. A man who had traded his soul for a dream that had turned into a nightmare. The next few days were a blur of cold coffee and hushed, angry conversations with Sarah. She didn't understand. She saw the empty bank account and the killer graffiti that appeared on their driveway overnight. And she saw a man who had failed her. Why couldn't you just sign the papers? She cried, her face pale and drawn. Why did you have to be the one to fix it? To fix it? Marcus didn't have an answer. He just knew that every time he closed his eyes, he saw Diego falling. The annual company picnic was held at Council Oak Park, a sprawling green space under the shadow of the Tulsa skyline. It was supposed to be a celebration of the Caldwell family, a day of BBQ and forced camaraderie. But this year, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. The heat was back, a humid, suffocating blanket that made the ribs smell sour and the beer taste flat. Marcus stood on the edge of the park, watching the hundreds of workers and their families. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and contempt. Elijah's rumors had done their work. Marcus was the greedy manager who had tried to frame the boss. Elijah was on the temporary stage, a microphone in his hand, his voice booming over the speakers. We've had a tragedy, Elijah said, his voice dripping with faux sincerity. And it breaks my heart to say that the man we trusted to keep us safe, the man I treated like a son, he failed us. He chose his own gain over your safety. Your safety. A low growl went through the crowd. Marcus felt the weight of 1,000 eyes. He felt the urge to run, to disappear into the trees and never look back. But then he saw Maria, Diego's mother, sitting in the front row, her face a mask of grief. And he saw the way Elijah smiled at her, a predatory, crocodile smile. Marcus didn't think. He just moved. He pushed through the crowd, ignoring the shoves and the hissed insults. He climbed the steps of the stage, his boots thumping against the plywood. Elijah stopped talking, his eyes narrowing. Marcus, don't do this. Don't make it worse. Worse. Marcus didn't say a word. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of papers. The real invoices, the bank transfers, and the photos he'd managed to take of the frayed rope before the warehouse confrontation. He didn't need the microphone. The park had gone deathly silent. This isn't about me, Marcus said, his voice raw but steady. It's about the ropes. The global safe ropes that cost $10 a spool while Elijah pocketed the rest. Here are the transfers. Here is his account number, his account. He began to throw the papers into the crowd, the white sheets fluttering like wounded birds in the heavy air. He didn't just let Diego fall, Marcus shouted, pointing at Elijah. He pushed him. He pushed him with every dollar he stole from the safety budget. He pushed him. The silence broke. It didn't break into a cheer. It broke into a roar of realization. The workers began to pick up the papers, their eyes scanning the numbers, the dates, the cold, hard proof of their own worth in Elijah's eyes. Elijah tried to speak, his face turning a mottled purple. "He's lying. He's a thief." But the crowd wasn't listening to him anymore. They were looking at the invoices. They were looking at the man who had sold their lives for a Zagorodny club. The surge was sudden. A wave of men in work shirts and heavy boots started toward the stage. Their faces weren't filled with grief anymore. They were filled with a cold, righteous fury. "Get him!" someone screamed. Marcus saw the terror in Elijah's eyes. The realization that his empire of glass was finally shattering. The crowd reached the edge of the stage, hands reaching out, voices a cacophony of rage. For a second, Marcus felt a dark thrill. He wanted to see them tear Elijah apart. He wanted to see the man who had ruined him suffer. But then he looked at Maria. She wasn't shouting. She was just watching, her eyes filled with a weary, ancient sadness. Marcus stepped between the crowd and Elijah. "No!" Marcus yelled, his voice cracking. "No! That's not how we do this. We don't become him. We don't." The crowd hesitated, the momentum of the mob faltering against Marcus's outstretched arms. "The police are on their way," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried. "I called them an hour ago. Let the law handle the thief. We have work to do. We have to take care of Diego. Take care." The rage didn't vanish, but it cooled, turning into a heavy, somber resolve. The workers backed away, leaving Elijah huddled at the back of the stage, a small, broken man in an expensive suit. The sirens began to wail in the distance. Not the sirens of an ambulance this time, but the sharp, rhythmic pulse of the law. The aftermath was a slow, painful dismantling. Caldwell and Son collapsed under the weight of a dozen lawsuits and a federal investigation. Elijah went to trial, his silver hair and white teeth failing to charm a jury of people who worked for a living. Marcus lost the house. He lost the dream of the Brookside lot. Sarah left him, unable to live with the wreckage of the life she thought they were building. But 6 months later, Marcus was back on a roof. It was a small house in Sand Springs, the wood old and weathered, the air smelling of pine and fresh rain. He wasn't the boss. He was just a man with a hammer and a new crew. 3 guys who had left Elijah's firm to follow the only man they trusted. Marcus knelt on the shingles, the sun warm on his back, but not burning. He checked the safety line, a thick, heavy-duty Titan rope, its core solid and unyielding. He ran his thumb over the nylon, feeling the strength of it. He looked over at his partner. Diego was in a wheelchair on the porch below, his legs still useless. But his eyes were bright, his hands busy as he prepped the flashing for the next section. He was alive. He was part of something real. Marcus stood up and walked to the edge of the roof, looking out over the rolling hills of Oklahoma. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. He didn't have the corner office. He didn't have the linen suits. He had a small bank account and a body that ached at the end of every day. But as he took a deep breath of the clean, evening air, he felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt solid. He felt like he was standing on a foundation that wasn't built on lies. He picked up his hammer and went back to work. Each strike was clean. Each strike was true. Each strike was a part of the new life he was building, one shingle at a time. The hammer fell, once, twice, into the stubborn row of wood. The impact vibrated up his arms, a dull ache that felt like home. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The past was a frayed rope, and he had finally cut himself free. Free.